Hello and welcome, friends. Today's story isn't just another debate, it's a turning point. What unfolded at the Kennedy Center wasn't about applause lines or headlines, it was about who truly speaks for the American heartland. So sit back, open your mind, and witness how one young leader stood toe-to-toe with a Hollywood legend and walked away with something far greater than fame. Let's begin. The chandeliers of the Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts cast a golden glow over a divided nation. Beneath its domed ceiling, where cellos once whispered and presidents once wept, an entirely different performance was about to begin. No overture, no applause, no script, only conflict. 1,000 Americans sat divided not just by the aisle but by worldview. On the left, polished coats, horn-rimmed glasses, and the glint of Hollywood donor. On the right, denim, service pins, weathered hands folded across work jackets. Veterans, steelworkers, fathers, each side came armed, not with weapons, but with truths they swore were undeniable. Tonight the Kennedy Center wasn't hosting a gala, it was a political crucible, a battle not of candidates but of ideals, and at center stage stood two symbols of America's fractured soul. Meryl Streep, icon, 3 Oscars, 21 nominations. For decades she shaped stories that stirred hearts and swayed nations. Dressed in white silk and gravitas, she walked slowly to her chair, nodding to the crowd like a monarch returning to court. Her name alone summoned reverence or resentment. Opposite her, with a steady stride and the poise of someone half her age but twice as unflinching, was Karoline Leavitt. At 27, she wasn't just the White House press secretary, she was the youngest in American history. But tonight, she wasn't speaking for the president, she was speaking for the country. No one in Hollywood seemed to remember. The one that works with its hands, counts its paychecks, and votes with its gut. As moderator James Whitmore cleared his throat, silence fell like a curtain. A man who once covered Gulf War briefings and Cold Town protests, Whitmore had seen America up close, and he knew this wasn't a debate. It was a reckoning. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, voice steady, eyes sharp, "tonight isn't about who gets the last word. It's about who speaks for the people no one applauds." He turned to Leavitt. She sat upright, blazer pressed, gaze sharp. To Streep, composed yet calculating. "Let's begin." The room held its breath. Not for a performance, but for a confrontation. And somewhere, deep in the hearts of working men who hadn't trusted a celebrity in years, a thought sparked. It's about damn time someone said what we've all been thinking. James Whitmore didn't waste time. He turned directly to Karoline Leavitt. "Miss Leavitt," he said, "critics claim this administration lacks compassion in its policies, particularly on immigration and border security. How do you respond?" Karoline didn't blink. She leaned forward slightly, elbows on the polished oak table, voice even and low, measured like a scalpel, not a sword. "With respect," she said, eyes steady on Whitmore, "compassion isn't measured by applause, it's measured by results." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "In the past 2 years," she continued, "we've reduced violent crime in border towns by 21%. We've secured over 500,000 American jobs by enforcing immigration laws already on the books, and we've increased legal immigrant resettlement funding by 15%, more than the previous administration by a mile. Those are facts." Her words sliced through the room like a blade. On the left, brows furrowed. On the right, heads began to nod. She wasn't performing. She was presenting evidence, cold, clear, undeniable. Meryl Streep sat still, lips pursed. She had expected rhetoric. What she got was a bullet-point audit of reality. Karoline continued, flipping through her notes but never breaking eye contact with the crowd. "I've heard the stories. I've seen the tearful speeches, but stories don't pay rent. Stories don't put food on the table. Policies do. Real governance isn't about feelings, it's about fixing problems, and we are." The MAGA side of the audience stirred, a few murmurs of approval rising. But Leavitt wasn't finished. "When you hear someone say this administration is cruel," she said, "ask them for numbers. Ask them what specifically we've done that's harmed American families. Because what I see, every single day, is the opposite." She raised a document, held it high. "This is a Department of Labor report from Q3. Manufacturing jobs are up. Border arrests for repeat offenders down. Inflation stabilized. Median income for working-class families? Up 3.1%. That's not a headline. That's reality." There was no roar from the audience, just the quiet, humming power of truth soaking into men who'd built houses, fought wars, and watched politicians make promises that never showed up in their paychecks. Leavitt didn't promise, she proved. And then she struck the nerve. "There's this idea," she said slowly, "that caring means crying on stage, that it means tweeting a poem or quoting a movie. But I've met the people who don't have time for symbolism. The man who works 12-hour shifts to keep his small business afloat. The veteran whose son got a job at the steel plant because of our tariff reforms. The single mom who now qualifies for a food subsidy we expanded. They don't need tears, they need truth." Silence. Even some on the liberal side paused. Streep sat motionless, and Whitmore, an old reporter who had seen spin from both sides, nodded almost imperceptibly. This wasn't spin, this was steel. "Thank you, Ms. Leavitt," he said. A few claps, tentative, then louder, from the conservative side. Meryl shifted in her seat. It was her turn next. But the opening blow had been delivered. Clean, best stating. James Whitmore let the silence breathe before turning to the left side of the stage. "Ms. Streep," he said, "you've long spoken about art's role in shaping compassion. How do you respond to Ms. Leavitt's numbers?" Meryl Streep inhaled slowly, her hands folded delicately in her lap. The stage lights caught the shimmer of her white silk jacket, giving her the glow of someone ready for a performance. And perform she did. She sat up, gaze sweeping the room with the confidence of a woman who'd once brought entire theaters to tears with a glance. "Karoline speaks of numbers," she began, her voice smooth as a violin in a quiet hall. "But I'm here to speak of people." She didn't address Leavitt. Not yet. Instead, she painted a scene. "Last month," she said softly, "I visited a shelter in El Paso. I met a little girl, 6 years old, named Lucia. She had one shoe. One. Her mother had been deported 2 weeks earlier. No warning, no goodbyes. Just gone." She let the words hang, eyes flickering toward the audience. "The staff told me Lucia cries herself to sleep each night. She clutches her mother's scarf like it's the only thing keeping her breathing." A woman in the liberal section sniffled. The crowd was hooked. Not by evidence, but by feeling. Streep leaned forward, voice trembling just enough to sound sincere. "I ask you, what are we becoming? When the law tears children from their mothers and tells us it's necessary." Applause erupted from the left side of the room. Emotional. Proud. Even some on the right sat stone-faced, not because they agreed, but because the pain in her voice was hard to ignore. She continued, "This administration claims it's fixing problems, but some problems," she said, turning toward Leavitt at last, "aren't meant to be fixed with data. They're meant to be felt." Her words sparked another round of applause, more forceful this time. She was commanding the stage now, voice rising like a crescendo. "I've played characters who've lost children. I've wept on screen. But nothing prepared me for Lucia's face. That wasn't art, that was truth." Leavitt sat still, eyes locked, not blinking, not flinching, just listening, like a soldier calculating her return fire. Streep's hands trembled slightly as she folded them again, her voice lowering to a whisper. "I don't need statistics to know that pain. I saw it, I felt it, and I will never forget it." The applause was thunderous from the liberal side. Some stood, a few wiped tears, but then something happened. A shift, subtle. Men in the back row, blue-collar jackets, veterans' pins, arms crossed, didn't clap. They watched, unmoved. To them, this was a scene, a performance. Beautiful maybe, but still a story. And in their minds, a question lingered. Where's the solution? James Whitmore waited until the room quieted. Then he turned back to Leavitt. "Miss Leavitt," he said, "you've heard the story of Lucia." "Your response?" Leavitt adjusted her microphone. And just like that, the theater shifted back to the war room. Karoline Leavitt didn't speak right away. She let the applause from Streep's monologue fade, let it echo, settle, and finally die. Then, with the silence sharpening like a drawn blade, she leaned in, her voice calm and calculated. "I thank Miss Streep for her story," she began, eyes locked on the crowd, not her opponent. "It's powerful, it's moving, but with respect. When policies are on the table, stories without specifics are not solutions, they are sentiment." The words hit like a cold gust through the warm Kennedy Center air. Streep shifted slightly in her seat. Leavitt's tone didn't rise. It didn't need to. "I listened carefully," she continued. "Lucia, one shoe, a scarf, a mother allegedly deported, but no date, no case number, no agency named, no evidence." She turned, finally, her full attention to Streep. "Miss Streep, can you provide the name of the mother, the deportation record? Was it a criminal deportation or a civil one? Did it involve repeat border crossings or was it a first-time entry? Because if it's real, truly real, let's address it, but if not, what are we doing here?" Gasps rippled through the audience. Not loud, but enough to register. On the left, jaws tightened. On the right, smirks emerged. In the middle, a sea of blinking eyes, unsure who to follow. Streep looked stunned. She opened her mouth, then paused. I wasn't there when the deportation happened," she said, her voice faltering for the first time. "I was told the story by the shelter workers." Leavitt nodded slightly, as if she had expected the answer. Then, like a prosecutor who's just gotten the answer she wanted, she shifted the tempo. "Let me tell you what I do know," she said, flipping open a slim folder. "The administration processed 1.8 million legal asylum cases in the last 36 months. 70% were granted relief. At the same time, deportations of individuals with felony convictions, violent offenses, rose by 26%. Not families, not toddlers, felons." The MAGA side of the crowd began to murmur, low approval building. "Compassion," Leavitt said, "isn't letting anyone in. It's protecting those who come through the door legally. It's protecting Americans already inside." She held up a printed graph. Border crossings, job statistics, deportation breakdowns by offense. "I'm not reciting bedtime stories, I'm showing what's actually happening. If a journalist printed Lucia's story without verifying it, they'd be fired. So why do we allow public figures to speak with no accountability?" Streep's jaw tightened. She leaned forward. "I'm not a policymaker, Karoline. I'm an artist. I speak to what I see, what I feel." Leavitt didn't flinch. "Exactly. You feel, but I govern." It was brutal, and the audience felt it. Whitmore, the moderator, attempted to redirect. "Miss Leavitt, surely emotion still has a place in public life." Leavitt cut in, politely but firmly. "Emotion is not policy, and we don't write laws on instinct." She turned again to Streep, delivering the blow with surgical calm. "Hollywood makes people feel. The White House makes people safe. One is a stage, the other is a responsibility." There was a beat, a full second where the room stood still. Then came the shift. A man in the back row of the conservative side stood and clapped. Once, hard, then again. Another followed, and another. A ripple. Applause built not from pity, but from recognition. Recognition that someone had finally said aloud what many had thought for years. Streep's mouth opened, trying to respond, but her words were slower now, heavier. "You're talking about numbers." "I'm talking about people." Karoline didn't rise. She didn't gloat, she simply said, "People deserve more than anecdotes. They deserve the truth." Another wave of applause, this time louder, and in that moment clear, sharp, undeniable. The power in the room shifted. The performer had lost the narrative, and the press secretary, with nothing but precision and patience, had seized it. James Whitmore, sensing the momentum shift, leaned into the fire. "Let's pivot," he said, glancing at both women. "What does it mean, today, to be in touch with the American people, with real America?" Meryl Streep responded first. Her voice, now steadier, carried that signature resonance that once moved millions. "Art connects us," she said. "Film, theater, they open doors to empathy. They remind us of who we are. That's what I try to do. That's what Hollywood tries to do. We reflect the human condition." She paused, eyes soft. "We may live on the coasts, yes, but we care about every American. We use our platform to speak for the voiceless." Applause rang out from her half of the room. Clean, elegant, but noticeably smaller than earlier. Streep smiled faintly. She had said what she needed to say. Then came Leavitt. She didn't smile, she didn't sip water. She just leaned forward, like a contractor explaining why a foundation failed. "Hollywood reflects something," she said, "but lately, it's not the country most Americans live in." Her voice remained cool, but the tension behind it was palpable. "You talk about empathy, Miss Streep. But where was that empathy when working-class voters were mocked for how they talk, where they live, or what they believe? Where was that connection when your colleagues stood on stage calling Middle America deplorable or backward?" There was a sudden stillness in the hall. Leavitt kept going. "You say you give voice to the voiceless, but the coal miner in West Virginia doesn't have a Netflix special. The rancher in Montana doesn't get a standing ovation. The trucker in Missouri, the man who hasn't missed a day since 2003, he doesn't trend on Twitter. He gets ignored. Or worse, he gets insulted." The MAGA side began to stir again, heads nodding, fingers tapping armrests. "You see, I know those people," Leavitt said. "I come from them. I've eaten at diners where people talk about feeding their families, not winning Oscars. I've seen the hospital bills, the layoffs, the empty factories. That's America too." She turned slightly toward the audience now, not grandstanding, but testifying. "Real America doesn't live on a studio lot. It doesn't walk red carpets, and it certainly doesn't have a press agent. It wakes up before sunrise. It works with its hands. It keeps its mouth shut, and it votes when it's tired of being talked down to." The room had shifted again. Even some liberal attendees sat up straighter. Meryl Streep tried to reassert herself. "Karoline, I respect your background, but don't pretend that artists don't care. We march, we donate, we bring attention to issues that would otherwise go unseen." Leavitt didn't flinch. "You bring attention," she said, "but we bring solutions." She let it hang, then added almost quietly, "You act for a living. I act for a country." That line hit like a hammer. A slow-building cheer rose from the right side of the audience. Men with calloused hands, worn boots, and weary eyes, now lit with something sharp and rare: vindication. For years they had been told they didn't understand the world, that they were out of touch, that their values, faith, hard work, loyalty, were outdated. But tonight, someone was speaking their language on the stage of the elite. Not apologizing, not compromising, just standing. Street's response came slower now, more defensive. "You don't need to diminish others to make your point." Leavitt simply nodded once. "And you don't need a spotlight to find the truth." Whitmore, caught in the gravity of the exchange, took a breath before interrupting. "Ladies," he said, "we'll move now to the media." But in that moment it was clear, the lines were no longer about policies, they were about people. And in that collision between heartland grit and Hollywood glow, only one side was still standing taller. As the applause died down, James Whitmore leaned into the next flashpoint. "Let's talk about the press," he said. "There are growing claims that media freedom is under threat. Others argue that bias, not censorship, is the real problem. Miss Streep, you've spoken often about journalism and truth. Your thoughts?" Meryl Streep sat straighter, almost relieved to pivot away from the cultural clash. "A free press is the foundation of democracy," she said, voice clear, practiced. "But today we're watching journalists threatened, sidelined, even blacklisted for speaking truth to power. When fear replaces freedom, the system breaks." Applause erupted from her section. She turned slightly toward Leavitt. Her tone sharpened. I've heard from reporters, seasoned ones, who say they've been frozen out for asking the wrong questions. That's not patriotism, that's control. Karoline Leavitt barely moved, but her response came like a hammer wrapped in silk. "Miss Streep," she said, "Hollywood sells drama for a living, but this idea that the government is silencing the press? That's a script, not a fact." She reached down, lifted a binder, and opened it with care. Last year, this administration issued over 250 new licenses to independent outlets, up 20% from the previous term. 95% of active press credentials remain intact. Across every major media group, the liberal side of the crowd fell quiet. The conservative side leaned in. And let's be honest, Leavitt continued, it's not the journalists asking questions who are upset. It's the ones who get caught twisting the answers. She held up a news clipping. This report right here, aired by a top cable network, claimed border enforcement had tripled deportations. The real number? Inflated by 31%. Proven false, no retraction, no apology. Just another clickbait headline painting law enforcement as monsters. The right side of the audience murmured loudly, some clapping, others calling out, "Exactly," Streep interjected, visibly bristling. "You can't ignore the chilling effect. Even if journalists aren't silenced officially, they're pressured." Leavitt didn't blink. There's no greater pressure than public accountability. If a journalist is afraid of being fact-checked, they're not doing journalism, they're doing theater. Her words hit hard, and the message was clear. Emotion doesn't equal evidence. Streep's claims, though heartfelt, began to sound abstract. While Leavitt came armed with dates, numbers, and names, Whitmore stepped in. "So, you're saying media manipulation is the issue, not suppression?" Leavitt nodded. "Yes. The biggest threat to truth today isn't government, it's narrative. And the elite institutions shaping it aren't in D.C. anymore. They're in studio lots and newsrooms that forgot who they're supposed to serve." Thunderous applause followed, from men who'd felt dismissed by polished anchors and headline-drun hysteria. For them, Leavitt wasn't just defending the administration, she was defending them. Streep, silent now, adjusted her microphone but said nothing. The battle for the narrative was slipping from her hands. James Whitmore's voice cut through the momentary hush. "Let's turn to the economy," he said. "Tariffs, jobs, wages. Critics say this administration's protectionist policies are hurting everyday Americans. Ms. Leavitt, your response?" Karoline Leavitt straightened, tapping a thick folder beside her. "Hurting Americans?" she repeated. "Let me walk you through what hurting actually looks like." She flipped open the file with the precision of someone who knew every page. "Since implementing our targeted steel and aluminum tariffs, we've increased U.S. steel production by 25%. That's not Wall Street noise, that's shifts being added. That's paychecks going home." She paused, her gaze sweeping the crowd. 60,000 manufacturing jobs were saved. Yes, saved by these policies. That's 60,000 fathers, sons, veterans, union workers who didn't have to pack up their tools and pray someone would call them back. Applause broke out from the right. Leavitt didn't. Under this administration, inflation has remained at 2.1%. While other countries are seeing costs spiral out of control, we've kept food prices and energy relatively stable. Why? Because we renegotiated trade deals that for decades gave away American labor like it was disposable. She tapped her notes. "We don't believe in free trade. We believe in fair trade. And if defending American industries means upsetting a few global executives or celebrity chefs in Manhattan, I think we can live with that." Streep leaned into her mic, her voice tight. "But what about the small businesses paying more for raw materials, or working-class families struggling with price increases on basics? Tariffs are a tax. They punish the people first." Leavitt turned to her, composed. "No, Miss Streep. Poor policy punishes the people. Tariffs defend them." She faced the audience again, raising her voice, not with anger but with resolve. "Let's talk about the American welder whose job was outsourced to China, or the machinist whose factory became a parking lot because politicians were too afraid to say no to foreign lobbyists. Those aren't just numbers, that's 30 years of betrayal. There were shouts of agreement from the back rows. Someone called out, "Damn right." Leavitt went on. "You say working-class families are struggling. I agree. That's why we expanded food subsidies, cut living costs by 15% for over 10 million households. That's why we increased veteran employment incentives and launched tax credits for small manufacturers reopening in forgotten towns." She held up a chart. Real wages for non-college educated men, up 2.8% in the last 18 months. That's not a slogan, that's a mortgage payment. That's health insurance for a kid. That's dignity. Streep tried to respond, but Leavitt didn't interrupt. She simply looked at her, then back to the audience. "We've heard a lot about what feels good," she said. "Let me tell you what works." The applause that followed was different now. It wasn't just political, it was personal. Men who'd once been told they were replaceable heard, maybe for the first time in years, that they mattered. In that moment, Leavitt wasn't a spokesperson, she was a symbol. And across the stage, the glow of Hollywood felt suddenly very far away. James Whitmore leaned forward, sensing the tension had peaked. "We've heard facts, and we've heard emotion," he said. "I'll ask each of you for your final thoughts. What does America need now? Truth or compassion?" Meryl Streep sat upright, her voice trembling but passionate. "We need both," she said. "We need truth with a heart. We need to remember that statistics don't feel the cold, or miss their mother, or bury their dreams. We need to see the human beings behind the number." She turned to the crowd, voice cracking with sincerity. "I'm not a politician. I don't carry binders. But I've met families living in fear. Immigrants, journalists, ordinary people whose only crime was dreaming in the wrong direction." A few claps rose from the left. She pressed on. "When we stop caring, when we turn our backs on pain just because it's hard to measure, that's when we lose what made America a light in the world." She paused, searching the room. "I stand for those who have no microphone, who can't sit on this stage. I stand for conscience." It was heartfelt, even powerful. But as she sat down, there was a hollow quiet, like a scene that should have landed, but missed the beat. Then Leavitt spoke. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "I respect what Miss Streep said," she began, her tone measured, "and I believe she believes every word. But here's the truth, and it's not easy to say. America cannot be led by sentiment. It must be led by service." The audience leaned in. "Feelings don't fund food programs. Passion doesn't rebuild factories. Tweets don't defend borders. What does? Policy, action, courage when no one's clapping." She stood now, slowly, deliberately. "I didn't come here to win a standing ovation," she said. "I came here to speak for the trucker in Ohio who hasn't seen a raise in 10 years, for the widow in Kentucky whose husband's job went overseas, for the young man in Michigan who's sick of being called privileged because he wears work boots." A wave of claps swelled from the right. "I came to say this. We've tried speeches, we've tried stars, and for a long time, America got silence in return." He took a final breath. "This administration may not be poetic, but we're present, we're accountable, and we're building a country where truth comes with results, not applause." There it was. Applause thundered through the conservative side. Men stood, fists raised, not in celebration, but in recognition. She hadn't spoken to them. She had spoken for them. Streep sat still, her eyes glistened. She tried to respond, but the moment had already closed. The applause wasn't stopping, it echoed like a verdict. Whitmore didn't need to say anything, the final blow had landed. As the lights dimmed inside the Kennedy Center, the echoes of applause still lingered like smoke after cannon fire. Meryl Streep sat motionless, her white silk jacket crumpled, hands folded tightly in her lap. She had poured out her emotion, her convictions, her heart, and still, she had been outmatched by something harder than charisma. She had been met by conviction, wrapped in composure, and backed by truth. Karoline Leavitt didn't raise her arms. She didn't bow. She simply turned, gave Whitmore a firm nod, and exited the stage like a soldier returning from duty, not a performer basking in praise. The men in the crowd, the retired Marines, the laid-off steel workers, the sons of farmers and factory hands, rose to their feet not in applause, but in silent unity. A new kind of leader had just claimed the ground. Outside the venue, conservative media swarmed. Headlines flashed within minutes. Leavitt redefines leadership. Hollywood just met its match. The era of performative politics is over. Online, videos of Leavitt's precision dismantling of emotion-driven narratives exploded. On forums across the country, men who had long felt alienated from public discourse posted one word: finally. Backstage, Leavitt sat alone for a moment, scrolling through messages from factory owners, veterans, and single mothers. One message caught her eye. "My son watched you tonight. He told me for the first time he wants to be like someone in government." She smiled, barely, and then she got back to work. In the days that followed, commentators from both sides would argue over the optics, the tone, the fallout, but one thing became clear. A new American standard had been set. One built not on showmanship or celebrity, but on principle, clarity, and courage. Karoline Leavitt didn't just win a debate, she changed the terms of engagement. And in a nation weary of slogans and stage lights, it wasn't just a victory for one woman, it was a moment that reminded millions what leadership used to mean, and what it could mean again. The Kennedy Center debate between Karoline Leavitt and Meryl Streep wasn't just a political event, it was a national mirror. On one side stood Hollywood's emotional storytelling, polished and passionate. On the other stood the voice of a younger generation armed with facts, accountability, and clarity. The lesson? In today's America, emotion alone no longer wins the room. Karoline Leavitt proved that pragmatism, backed by data, discipline, and unwavering resolve, can outshine even the most seasoned celebrity voices. Her victory wasn't loud or boastful. It was methodical, principled, and earned. She didn't dismiss compassion, she redefined it, linking it to action, not applause. For Americans who've felt forgotten, mocked, or ignored by coastal elites and media monologues, Leavitt offered more than policy. She offered a voice. A reminder that real leadership doesn't shout, it shows up, delivers, and leaves the spotlight behind. The story's deeper message is clear. In an era of noise and narratives, substance still matters. Americans are craving leaders who listen more than they lecture, who build more than they brand. Leavitt's performance didn't just shift the debate, it set a new cultural standard for how truth must walk side by side with courage.